Well, welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Creighton. We hope to have some more discussion on Bill C-293 this morning. I have a farmer, Vicki Dutton, who should be joining me momentarily. I apologize for the delay in the broadcast this morning. Yes, she's here. She's in the wings waiting, and we'll join Vicki momentarily. And this is going to be a fascinating discussion. I can guarantee you, folks, that we've got so much to talk about with this bill. This is the Trudeau vegan bill. It's going to turn Canada into a meatless nation. And when we come back, we'll talk to Vicki about her farming, why this bill got so far, and what she thinks it means for Canada. So we'll be right back. So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station right now. Let us know that you appreciate the work we're doing. I appreciate just hearing about it. Not to mention the fact it also helps us stop the YouTube suppression, because YouTube says, oh, people are watching this station. It's important. Maybe we don't like it, but somebody out there does. And that is actually, it's very important. It's very important to us. So thank you for supporting the station, and subscribe if you can. And if you have subscribed, make sure you still subscribe, because YouTube likes to unsubscribe people. It's really quite ridiculous. So I'm going to be joined momentarily here by Vicki Dutton from Saskatchewan, and let us go there now. I think Vicki is here. Good morning, Vicki.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us on Creighton's Right on Stand on Guard.
Thank you for covering this.
Well, I know you've been raising the flag for this for quite a while, and unfortunately, not enough people have been. That's what it comes down to.
I have to say, David, it hasn't actually been that long, because this bill has kind of been, unreally discussed by Canadians, which is actually one of the shocking things about this bill, because it's so huge and affects everything we do, and yet it's under the radar, and that is probably the biggest problem we have with this bill.
Well, that would certainly seem to be the case. Because this seemed to go from nowhere to third reading, and it passed. Now it's before the Senate, and I can't see much hope in the Senate, to be quite honest, because senators are not elected. They don't respond very well to public complaints. They don't listen to the public. Why should they? They're not accountable. They can do whatever the heck they want. They're there until 75, or when they decide they've had enough of freeloading. And I know there are some good senators, and we're going to be watching briefly with one of those good senators, a very close friend from the old days when I worked in the Hill, Senator Pamela Wallin, who seems to be concerned about this bill. But unfortunately, I don't know if you've watched the Senate lately, Vicki, but I went there recently to watch some of the activity around the carbon tax, and it's been subdivided now into 5 little groups. And you say, they're calling themselves what? Who are these people? But it turns out, okay, there's not really a Liberal Party group of senators anymore, but there's a bunch of woke party groups of senators, and their allegiance is not necessarily to the Liberal Party of Canada, as it used to be, but it's to Justin Trudeau. So when he said, okay, I'm going to sever the links between the government and the Senate in terms of the Liberal Party in the Senate, they're independent, he said, from now on. It was a farce, because he's continuing to appoint people who think the way he does, who want the same policies. So he can call them independent all he wants, but they're not. They're working for the same things Justin Trudeau is. And I don't see these people moving on Bill C-293. And of course, go ahead.
You certainly touched a nerve for me. I mean, I was a proponent of the Triple-E Senate for many years, and I lobbied for that, and still cannot understand why people will accept in a bicameral system an unaccountable type of process as this. And this is probably going to be the most huge test of sober second thought, which doesn't happen in our Senate, which is very sad given the rural nature of our country.
Well, that's very true. And I just put this slide up here. This is Sylvain Charlebois, of course, who is known as the food professor. And he's been actually doing quite a bit of work on this. And I referenced his column the other day where he wrote in the Toronto Sun that Bill C-293, it's a question for him, but it's more of a statement if you read the column. Bill C-293 is Canada's Vegan Act. And of course, if you read through the bill, which I did the other day, and like I say, this was not a bill I'm well acquainted with. I've been focused on the Online Harms Act, which of course is just as odious and just as dangerous, and that's coming down the pike. But Sylvain outlines three things in his column here. And it's right in the bill, and it's under section L and 2, 3, and 4 points. And it says this bill is going to regulate commercial activities that can contribute to pandemic risk, including industrial animal agriculture. There it is. Regulate. That's a weasel word. It can mean anything the government wants. Number 3, another weasel word, promote commercial activities that can help reduce pandemic risk, including the production of alternative proteins. Read vegan foods. Read non-meat. Read meatless Wednesday, meatless week, meatless February. Number 4, phase out commercial activities that disproportionately contribute to pandemic risk, including activities that involve high-risk species. Once again, this is aimed at stopping people from eating meat. And Sylvain Charlebois outlines this, and I think, thank God, somebody has been out there in the media doing this. And of course, he outlines them here in this post. And I didn't read this column or see this this post that he did on X prior to looking through the synopsis of the bill. And I underlined the same portions of this bill because they've leapt off the page at me. I've been reading bills for most of my adult life now. I sat on various committees when I worked in the House of Commons. They can be incredibly boring. You can sit there for 2 or 3 hours and wonder how to stay awake. But you get in the habit of looking for the guts of a bill. And I saw this immediately. I said, this bill is dangerous because it's vague and it's giving powers, unprecedented powers. And there's the bill right there, it's C-293. It's giving unprecedented powers to regulatory agencies, and it creates another, as we call them, czars. This is creating like a food czar that is going to go around and shut down meatpacking plants, farms, potentially, stockades, anything, because the powers are that vague. And I think this is absolutely frightening. And excellent Substack article that you forwarded to me, a closer look at Bill C-293, pandemic prevention or government overreach. And I think this is absolutely frightening. But I guess the question for me, for you, I've been acquainted with the agriculture industry for years because of family that's been very involved with it. And I've always said, you've got so many groups out there who are all trying to lobby the government on behalf of farmers and the agricultural sector. You've got groups that are specifically focused on grains, on the cattle industry, on beef itself, on canola. There's very widespread interest out there in agricultural groups, not just the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. That's just the beginning. I mean, there's the subgroups that target specific elements of farming. All of these groups are out there. People are getting extremely well paid to lobby the government and supposedly to write news releases and to write columns that are supposed to be fighting for farmers. I didn't see a single bit of activity over this bill from any of these farm groups. Where were they, Vicky?
I'm speechless. It is certainly touching on a nerve. First of all, I'd like to reference the fact that you have said something very pregnant, is that farming is very removed from the power structures of Ottawa. And in this bill, we will be even more farther removed. The question is, what happened to the farm groups? Apparently, the farm groups were reassured by the Liberal caucus that this was not going anywhere. It was a private member's bill. And suddenly they all voted for it 3 times, and then it ended up in the Senate. So perhaps the associations were given some false hope on this. But it is, there's things that really concern me. They're talking about a multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, collateral One Health approach, and I'm reading this, which includes human, animal, plant, and ecosystems. Who decides? Who decides this collaborative committee that's over Ottawa, over elected representatives, including premiers? They're going to train the members. I'm not that trainable, so I'm sure I won't be on this committee. So the question is, who is thinking about this? Who is going to be making sure that the Canadian welfare is going to be kept in line? This has a very international approach. It's a who approach. And indeed, where do Canadians sit on this? And indeed, the extended question is, where does rural farmers and rural people sit? We are so removed from decision-making powers.
Well, that is so true, and that's exactly the way the Trudeau government wants it. Because I don't know if there's any real understanding of agriculture from Justin Trudeau, or his ag minister for that matter. They've always put non-entities in agriculture, people who really have no understanding of it beyond a basic assumption that's probably something Canada needs. But the very fact that Trudeau would institute a carbon tax and somehow, and I don't want this to be a conversation about the carbon tax because we could go on all day, but for Trudeau not to realize that the carbon tax was going to have a potentially catastrophic effect on farmers. And he apparently doesn't, because he still winds off all of the talking points every time Poilievre or anybody else gets up in the House of Commons and says farmers are suffering as a result of your carbon tax. They're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes. They can't afford to heat their barns. They can't afford to do their business. And the Trudeau response is, well, they're getting more money back in their pockets from the carbon rebate than they're ever going to be spending on the carbon. It's all nonsense, of course. But he just doesn't get it and doesn't seem to care that farming is indispensable to Canadians. It's not just some hobby. It's not something that we could live without. I mean, it's one of those things, I would say it's just as important, if not more important, than having a national defense. Because you can't have a country without security. You can't have a country if you can't defend yourself. We can't have people living in a country if they can't feed themselves. And as I've spoken to Jerry Ritz a number of times in this show, the former ag minister, who now, of course, can speak his mind in entirety because he's no longer in politics. And he's so outraged at how the Trudeau government just doesn't understand and doesn't care whether farmers live or die. The regulations, the fact that they're telling them don't use any fertilizer, doesn't matter if it has an impact on your crop. So what? This is about climate change, isn't it? Not about feeding Canadians. Canada will no longer be able to feed the world. We've already probably gone past that milestone, but we won't even be able to feed ourselves if this continues. And I think this is another nail in the coffin, just the complete ignorance that this government shows towards ag, and I would say the complete, absolute attitude of almost despisal and hatred that they have for farmers. I don't think that's an overstatement. They just don't seem to think farmers are important. And this bill, to me, is everything. I mean, I'm furious with this Trudeau government for wanting to take away my free speech with Bill C-293, the Online Harms Act. But I'm furious with this government for wanting to take away my T-bone steaks because it's one of the last joys in life I have. And they're not going to do that to me. They're not going to do that to me. And when I saw this bill, I just said, what next from this government? Now we can't even have our steaks, our ribs, our chickens, or whatever. This is all going to be taken away by this government. And I think there needs to be an accounting here from the people who should have spoken out about this bill but didn't.
So one of the things you have to realize that the whole framework of this climate agenda is a zero meat agenda. It's very well documented in the C-40 that they want people to consume zero meat, and that's the intention to move into printed meat and bugs. So what we're dealing with here is an industry that is very fragile. Agriculture is a high capital, low profit business, and we need interdependent demand from all of the sectors, and most of them include poultry, beef, dairy, pork. What do we do with, we want to have ethanol, we want to have biodiesel, we want to have healthy proteins. Well, all the byproduct of those proteins gets fed as cellulose predominantly to beef, and certainly as waste products to the rest of the meat industry. So it's a very interdependent industry. So you start pulling out winners and losers from here, that someone in the high echelons of the WHO, in the 0.1% who believe scientific evidence, which isn't collaborated, that beef is bad for the climate, which is essentially where this comes from, as far as my mind. They're trying to destroy the agriculture so then they can have printed meat factories and basically bugs. So I guess the question for Canadians is this bill something that has been properly debated so Canadians can have a say on it? Do Canadians realize the impact of this above auto approach and the One Health approach, which includes a whole ecosystem of what is good for the world? And where do we have a say on this as Canadians? And that's the big question. And certainly farmers in this mix are very, very vulnerable because it directly attacks our industry and the fragileness of our interdependence on beef and other commodities as grain producers, for example, as oilseed producers. And yes, protein is made out of pulses, but guess what? I can only grow pulses on my farm 1 in 8 years. So I actually need cereals and oilseeds to complement, and to grow cereals and oilseeds, I need the byproducts to have a market. And that is animal protein.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, and probably not my viewers, but a lot of Canadians who assume farmers are just rich people. They got all that land, and all they have to do is just produce that crop every year, and everything's fine. And that, of course, shows, as you've just said, tremendous ignorance about what is involved in farming. This is a high-risk business.
It is. It's a very high-risk business.
Yes, and I think that's what Canadians need to understand, that we can't be playing games with farmers this way, with their livelihood. And of course, if you look at economic catastrophes in the past, including the Great Depression, who was affected most adversely and most quickly were farmers. Farmers were, how many thousands of farmers had to sell their land or foreclosed upon because they couldn't produce crops? There was economic disaster, and they were at the very center of it. So this idea that farmers are somehow insulated from economic disaster, economic decline, is of course a complete falsehood. And what I found interesting, Vicky, as I looked into private members' bills, I'm focused on one that's very high profile, C-63. Well, high profile if you're interested in free speech. If you're not, people don't even know it's out there, unfortunately. But at least it's a government bill, and the government has owned it. And the government says, this is where we want to go. We want censor speech. We're very proud of it. That's what the Trudeau government's all about. It's a censorship government. Other issues, though, that they're hiding. And the C-293 is a prime example of that. This is a private member's bill from a vegan member of parliament, a backbench MP who nobody even has probably heard of. But he's introducing this bill very quietly. Then it went 1, 2, 3 readings, gone into the Senate. Nobody noticed it. But as I speak, of course, there's a couple of other bills before Parliament. This one came up in April, I believe. It's Charlie Angus, the NDP member, who's retiring, but he's left behind. He's leaving behind this legislation. And if Parliament doesn't fold and call and if we don't have an early election before October 2015, this bill will certainly come up for vote. And this is his private member's bill. Will make it a crime to promote fossil fuels in Canada. And of course, just like farmers, the left, the hard left, the woke socialists hate the oil industry, and they really are convinced these people pose an existential threat to Canada, that they're producing horrible degrees of climate change phenomena, and we have to get rid of them. So this bill literally makes it a crime to put a bumper sticker on your car that says, "I love Alberta oil." This is insanity. But of course, this is the kind of insanity the Liberal caucus will vote for. And certainly the NDP will vote for this. And that's all they need to get this bill past third reading and into the Senate once again, where the woke Senate will just love this as a climate change bill. And they're gonna stamp the yes on this one. Another one coming up, just talked about this week. Another NDP private members bill. And the Trudeau announced in Northwest Territories this week that he's going to have a real good look at this bill because it sounds good. And this is about criminalizing any sort of so-called denial of the residential school system. So does that mean if somebody says, well, it wasn't exactly like the narrative we've been told by the Liberals, or the graveyard that was discovered turned out to be a hoax? Oh, criminalization, that's hate speech. Forget it. You're going to go to jail for that. This is what this bill is going to target. Another private member's bill. So this is what this government's doing. It's hiding some of its more extreme legislation behind private members' bills and pretending, hey, we don't have anything to do with this, folks. This is a private members' bill. And how did that get past third reading into the Senate? So I think we're looking at a very, very dangerous time here. And this is why I, amongst a lot of people on YouTube who are concerned we're going to lose our right to free speech because of the online harms bill, are also concerned we're going to lose our right to eat meat. We're going to lose our right to criticize history in Canada. We're going to lose our right to say oil and gas is an integral part of the Canadian economy, and we probably couldn't survive without it. People would be starving in Alberta. They wouldn't have jobs on the oil rigs. They would be doing janitorial jobs instead, like the Liberal government actually admitted in a private briefing note. So there's a tide coming against us, and we're racing against time right now to get rid of this Trudeau government before they can pass a preponderance of bad legislation that's coming down the pike. And C-293, I think, is one of the worst, if you can put it that way. And what's your feelings on this bill passing?
The Senate obviously is a rubber stamp. I'm going to rephrase. I tried to push with Michel Accord for an equal elected effective Senate as a bicameral balance. Many of these bills would fail under the scrutiny of a Senate that equally represented the members of the Federation and wasn't appointed as a lapdog. So indeed, I think this bill is coming through. I think Canadians need to be fully aware of what it intends. Everybody should read this and fully understand the clauses. It is not open, accountable, transparent. It's above that. It's power structure. It changes, it internalizes or basically legislates international One Health approach. Saskatchewan had a very different approach to COVID than many other provinces, much more open because we're a rural province. That would not be possible in the future, I would doubt. So people need to consider that this bill is beyond everything else. But many of the tools that have been given to them in C11, C18, C63 to basically censor opinion will be repeated in this bill. There is a communication clause that says we will determine the dialogue. It's right in there. We're going to be able to control the information, and we're tracking people with this bill. It was done illegally during COVID. This will now make it legal. So a lot of issues here. And I think the biggest point that I appreciated was Sylvain Charlebois was when he said, how did this come through without people knowing about it? How did mainstream media not say to Canadians, this is a game changer for you? I mean, private media is now doing an awesome job of bringing this forward. Thank you very, very much. But this needs to be a debate on national television. Where do Canadians see the control of the future for human, animal, plant, and ecosystems and the welfare of Canadians? Do we trust our elected representatives? Do we want an open, accountable, transparent system restored? What do we want to do? Where do we want to go? This is a game changer.
Well, it certainly is a game changer, and also indicative of the contempt this government has for average Canadians. Let's have a clip here with Sylvain Charlebois and Pamela Wallen, which I think is quite interesting.
Professor, here this week we talk about Bill C-293. Say what? Bill C-293. You've never heard of it, but that bill could change our entire agri-food sector.
There's a piece of legislation coming from the House, a private member's bill actually, that has landed in the Senate, Bill C-293. Measures to regulate commercial practices to try and minimize pandemic risks. This is how it's being proposed. We're getting a ton of mail in here about this. What do you know and what do you think about this?
There's something I don't understand about this bill. What's the strategic intent here? I mean,
Yeah.
what's the spirit behind this bill? What are we trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to pick winners and losers? Is that what we're trying to achieve? Is it about real risks, or is it about perceptual risks? Is it about perhaps enticing Canadians to eat differently? I'm honestly, Senator, when I read the bill, and I read the bill 2 days ago, I'm very, very confused. I have no idea what this bill is trying to accomplish, to be honest.
We're getting so many, comments from the public saying, what are we trying to do here? Control, the pandemic responses when it comes to animals as well, vaccines, that there's a lot of activity around on that too. And that would then, you could make a case to people they shouldn't be eating as much meat. They should be using other product. Like, there's lots of questions that people have about this. So there's something going off in your brain as well.
I think the fact that it went through the House points to the fact that the House itself is currently a mess. I mean, there's
not paying attention.
I don't see this any other way, to be honest, Senator. I'm quite concerned. I mean, we have a dysfunctional parliament. So if parliament falls and there's an election coming up, I don't think Canadians are going to lose, no matter what the outcome of the election is.
Yeah.
I do think that perhaps we need to do a Control-Alt-Delete on the House.
I love the way he concludes there, a Control-Alt-Delete. Because, or hit the escape button. We need to get out of this somehow. It's become insurmountable if this government continues to exist. Unfortunately, there was another non-confidence vote yesterday that was defeated. The Bloc is appearing to move away from their support for the government by October 29th. I'm still predicting a November election. I think that's still possible, because the NDP is looking at the polls and they're actually moving past the Liberals, which I think would give them some inclination to move towards an election. God willing, because if they don't, there is, as I said, so much bad legislation coming down that's imminent in the next couple of months. So I think we need an election. And as Sylvain says there, hit the Control-Alt-Delete button. I can't see any other way out of this at this time. Can you?
Well, so we have to realize the faith in elections in Western Canada is less confident here is that we're going to be represented in Ottawa as farmers for sure. Certainly, we've always fared better under a capital understanding government, which recognizes the international boundaries of our business and doesn't cause trade wars like with China, who is our major client. I'm going to go to my base point. We need a bicameral balance, Triple E Senate. Sorry. I mean, it's probably never going to happen. But unless we can send bills that are ridiculous to a Senate as a super house of second thought, and they say, would Canadians like that? Not would this party like that? Is this good for Canada? We're going to continue to see these bills from that we would, most of us would think, how did that get through? Most of us do. Passing and becoming law in Canada. And Bill C-293 is the one that which should make us shake our heads, and will if it's implemented for many years. Now, we do have to hope that we have a government change and this gets rescinded. The question is, will the Liberal Senate let it go? Will they let it be gotten rid of? I don't know. How much power will they take? The Senate has never taken power, but what if it did?
Well,
post-Liberal.
It's interesting. You anticipated my final remarks here, because I'm meaning to talk to Senator Wallen about this issue, because nobody else wants to talk to me about it in the Senate, including Conservative senators. But what happens when we have a Conservative government in the future? And we will. There's going to be a pure polity of government by 2025, assuming elections aren't canceled in Canada. And I don't take that off the agenda with Justin Trudeau.
Nobody does.
But assuming,
Nobody should.
But assuming we have an election, either an early one in November or a spring one, or we wait till October 2025 and we have an election, I think it's a fair statement to make that Pierre Poilievre will be the next prime minister and the Conservative Party will form the next government. However, as a lot of people aren't considering, what happens to conservative bills when they reach the Senate? Because the Senate is a morass, as I said, of woke ideology. It's composed of a bunch of completely left-wing, ideologically woke senators who are going to be unalterably opposed to conservative legislation. Everything that comes up from the House is going to be stopped. I think this is going to lead to a constitutional crisis that we've never seen in Canada because the Senate has always behaved properly. And we always sort of had a polite understanding that the Senate really was that institution of sober second thought, as Sir John A. Macdonald described it, and that it wasn't there to be obdurate, to obstruct legislation from the democratically elected House. It didn't see itself as the real power that's going to stop this legislation from destroying Canada because they think Pierre Poilievre, he's Canada's Donald Trump. He's going to destroy the country. He's going to destroy the climate change legislation. He's going to destroy all the good things Justin Trudeau did. And they will justify obstructing conservative legislation on that basis, that they're saving Canada, just like the Democrats love to do in the United States. And I think this is the real danger that's coming from the Senate in the future, is that they could be an absolute source of contention, stopping conservative legislation. And this happened in Great Britain at the turn of the 20th century, when the House of Lords refused to pass legislation that enlarged the rights of voters, that actually increased the tax rate amongst the very rich. The House of Lords refused to pass that, and there was a constitutional crisis in Britain over this same issue over 120 years ago. So I can see the same thing happening in Canada here, where we're going to have to do something with the Senate. And I've been a Triple E advocate my whole life. I was with the Reform Party in those days, and I was completely behind that concept because I didn't think it was going to get this bad, where we have a Senate that is just so out of touch with reality. But it has gotten that bad. And I don't see any alternative but to start electing these people. So they are accountable, because they're accountable to nobody now except Justin Trudeau. And as I joked the other day, if you look back at other countries where politicians or people were accountable to the leader, you can find that in other European countries in the 1930s. And I can't say it on YouTube at the risk of being demonetized, but it's very frightening how these senators have a personal allegiance to Justin Trudeau. And even after he's gone, they're going to have an allegiance to woke politics. And I think this is not spell a bright future for Canadian politics in the future. So I'll leave the last words to you, Vicky. Anything you'd like to sum up?
Well, I would just like to urge everyone to look at this bill and to realize how it changes Canada and how we govern. I would urge everyone to write their Senate, to write a personal letter. I would urge them to contact every NDP MP and ask them why they're supporting this. I would urge them to recognize that many of the things we value as Canadians, which is freedom of speech, freedom of business, freedom of movement, is subject in this bill. This is a decline. This is a moment in time when you need to pay attention. And hopefully the senators, if they do receive enough mail and enough sober thought from people, they will recognize that this bill is not for the health of Canada. Far from it.
Well, I think on that note, we'll leave it there. Please, if you're listening, if you're watching today, get the word out. There is a chance, always a chance, as long as there's life, of getting the senators to see reason on this. Getting the senators to realize this is just contrary to good common sense. Getting the senators to realize that this is not going to do anything to enhance their climate change agenda, that this is just foolishness. This is absolute foolishness. And it's going to potentially eradicate not just an industry in Canada, but the personal enjoyment of millions of Canadians. And it's just, this represents a government that's out of control and private members' bills that are out of control. So thank you so much for joining me today, Vicky. I think this goes a long way. This is our second show in a couple of days now on Bill C-293. We're going to continue to get the word out, continue to fight for farmers, continue to fight against this bill as long as we can. And once again, thank you for being a part of the episode today.
Thank you.
And we will stay in touch, and please continue to notify us of issues and concerns that we need to know about here.
Thank you. And one last word, support private media. Always support private media.
Thank you so much. Do as Vicky says. And thank you for joining us today on Stand on Guard. We'll be back again with another show tomorrow with all the news that you need to know so you can continue to resolve.